April 15th, 1817, at precisely 9 o'clock in the evening, Clara Whitmore stood precisely where she belonged, which was to say, nowhere that mattered at all. The servants' staircase of Lady Pemberton's grand London townhouse wound upward into shadow and downward into the blazing spectacle of the season's most anticipated ball, and Clara occupied that in-between realm as naturally as she breathed, neither quite servant nor quite guest, visible to no one and noted by none. Below her, the ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, their light catching on silk gowns in shades of rose and ivory and palest blue, on jewels winking at elegant throats, on the polished boots of gentlemen moving through the figures of a country dance. Spring flowers, masses of white lilac and early roses adorned every surface, their fragrance drifting upward even to her shadowed vantage point, carrying with it the mingled scents of expensive perfumes and beeswax and champagne. Clara's fingers tightened on the smooth wooden banister as she watched, her grey dress, simple and high-necked and utterly unremarkable, seeming to absorb the shadows around her until she became little more than a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had no place for impoverished gentlewomen of 26 years with no fortune, no connections, and no prospects beyond a position as companion to the kind but socially conscious Lady Georgiana Sinclair. She should not have been watching at all. Lady Georgiana had retired an hour earlier with a headache, releasing Clara from her duties, and propriety dictated Clara should have gone directly to their lodgings. Yet something had drawn her here, some terrible longing she could not quite suppress despite 8 years of training herself to expect nothing, to want nothing, to be content with invisible usefulness. Her gaze found him without conscious intention, as it had 3 times already this evening. Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Thornfield, moved through the dance with the bored elegance of a man fulfilling tedious obligations, his formal black attire a stark contrast to the peacock display around him, his dark hair catching the candlelight as he turned. Even from this distance, Clara could see the polite emptiness in his expression as he partnered Miss Sophia Langley through the steps, then Lady Caroline Montague, then another young lady whose name Clara did not know. He was handsome in the way of marble statuary, remote and perfect and utterly untouchable, belonging to a sphere so far above her own that watching him felt like standing on earth and studying the stars. 2 housemaids passed behind her, their whispers carrying clearly in the enclosed stairwell. One said something about companions being no better than they should be, lurking about where they weren't wanted, and the other laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Clara did not flinch. She had learned not to flinch. She allowed herself one final look at the impossible beauty below, at the world that would never be hers, at the Duke who would never know she existed. Then Clara gathered her grey skirts and prepared to retreat into the darkness where she belonged, where women like her always belonged. But something made her pause, some foolish, stubborn fragment of hope she had not yet managed to kill. One more moment, just one more. Alexander Pembroke had developed, over the course of 32 years and the bearing of a dukedom since the age of 24, a particular skill for appearing engaged in social obligations while his mind wandered leagues away. And tonight he had perfected this art through 2 hours of dancing with young ladies whose names he would not remember come morning, whose eager smiles blurred together into a single mask of matrimonial ambition. He moved through the figures of yet another country dance with the bored precision of a man performing a duty, his hand guiding Miss Sophia Langley through a turn, his expression fixed in polite pleasantness that concealed the profound tedium threatening to suffocate him beneath the weight of 1,000 candles and the cloying perfume of spring flowers banked along every wall. His friend Richard stood at the edge of the floor, watching with amusement that Alexander found irritating, and Alexander made a mental note to leave within the quarter hour to escape back to his study, where at least the contracts and correspondence awaiting him served some purpose beyond the perpetuation of empty ritual. Then something caught his attention, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision that drew his gaze upward to the shadowed servants' staircase that wound along the ballroom's eastern wall. At first he saw nothing but darkness, punctuated by the dim glow of a single candle on the landing. But then the light shifted, and he glimpsed her, a figure in grey standing motionless in the shadows, her face pale in the darkness, her posture suggesting both longing and resignation. She was watching the dancers below with an intensity that transformed observation into something approaching hunger, yet there was nothing grasping in her expression, nothing calculating, only a wistfulness that struck him as profoundly sad. Alexander missed a step in the dance, recovering smoothly enough that Miss Langley noticed nothing, but his attention had fractured completely. The woman on the stairs was not dancing, was not even present in any way that mattered to the glittering assembly below, yet something about the way she stood there, the way she held herself with dignity despite her obvious exclusion, arrested him entirely. She was not beautiful by society's exacting standards. He could see even from this distance, her features too strong, her figure too slender, her age clearly beyond the first blush of youth. But there was something in her bearing that suggested an inner life far richer than anything on display in the ballroom. He watched as she lifted one hand to the banister, her fingers pale against the dark wood, watched as she began to turn away as though preparing to retreat into deeper shadows. Without conscious thought, Alexander found himself concluding the dance with expedient haste, bowing to Miss Langley, and making his way toward Richard with purpose sharpening his movements. Richard raised an eyebrow at his approach, gesturing with his champagne glass toward the staircase and saying something dismissive about servants lingering where they ought not, about companions and poor relations who should know better than to gawk at their betters. Alexander felt an unexpected flash of irritation at his friend's casual cruelty, at the ease with which Richard dismissed someone he had not even truly seen. His gaze returned to the staircase, just as the woman seemed to sense she had been noticed, just as alarm flashed across her features and she stepped back into the shadows. The orchestra shifted into the opening strains of a waltz, that scandalous import from Vienna that still made matrons frown and young ladies blush. And Alexander made a decision that surprised him with its immediacy. He crossed the floor with deliberate strides, ignoring Lady Caroline Montague's attempt to catch his attention, his eyes fixed on the darkened staircase and the grey figure retreating into shadow. And in that moment, something in the tedious pattern of his existence cracked open to reveal the possibility of something he could not yet name, but suddenly, desperately wanted to discover. Alexander Pembroke had abandoned dance partners before, had excused himself from tedious conversations with practiced ease, but he had never before simply walked away from a young lady mid-waltz with the kind of singular purpose that now propelled him across the ballroom floor, through the shocked clusters of guests, toward the shadowed doorway that led to the servants' passages where the woman in grey had disappeared. He heard Richard call after him, heard the whispers rising like a wave behind him, but these sounds belonged to a world that had suddenly become irrelevant compared to the urgency driving him forward into the dimly lit corridor that smelled of beeswax and old wood and the faint traces of kitchen herbs drifting up from below. The passage was narrow and utilitarian, its walls bare plaster rather than silk, its floors plain wood rather than polished marble, and Alexander had to pause to let his eyes adjust to the dimness after the brilliant candlelight of the ballroom, listening for footsteps, for the rustle of skirts, for any indication of which direction she had fled. He found her in a small anteroom off the main passage, a space clearly designated for last-minute repairs to gowns and coiffures, where Lady Georgiana Sinclair sat before a modest mirror, while the woman in grey knelt beside her, pins held between her lips as she worked to repair a torn flounce on Georgiana's rose silk gown. Both women looked up at his entrance, Georgiana's expression shifting rapidly from surprise to alarm to confusion, the companion's face draining of all colour as she rose swiftly to her feet, the pins scattering to the floor with tiny metallic sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Alexander knew he should apologize for the intrusion, should retreat and send a maid to announce him properly, should follow any of the 1,000 protocols that governed such moments, but instead he found himself standing in the doorway, looking at the woman in grey with an intensity that bordered on rudeness, taking in details he had not been able to discern from across the ballroom, the intelligence in her grey eyes, the strength in her features, the dignity in her bearing despite her obvious distress. Georgiana stammered something about the Duke of Thornfield, began to rise despite her torn gown, but Alexander raised a hand to forestall her, his voice emerging more roughly than he intended as he requested an introduction to her companion, and Georgiana, flustered and clearly bewildered, complied with the kind of automatic obedience ducal rank commanded, her words tumbling over each other as she presented Miss Clara Whitmore, her dear companion these past 3 years. Clara sank into a curtsy that suggested years of training in deportment. Her eyes lowered, her hands trembling slightly where they gripped her grey skirts, and Alexander found himself absurdly irritated by her subservience, by her retreat into proper invisibility, by her refusal to meet his gaze with the same direct intensity he had glimpsed when she watched from the stairs. He heard himself speaking words he had not planned, his request that Miss Whitmore honour him with the next dance, and the shock that transformed both women's faces might have been amusing under other circumstances, Clara's protests about propriety and her position emerging in a low, cultivated voice that confirmed his suspicion of genteel origins, fallen on hard times. Alexander dismissed her objections with a certainty that surprised even himself. His statement that he saw no impropriety in dancing with a gentlewoman cutting through her resistance, even as Georgiana's expression shifted from shock to worry to something approaching fear for her companion's reputation. But Alexander was already extending his hand, already waiting with a patience that was not patience at all, but rather determination transformed into stillness. And after a moment that stretched into eternity, Clara placed her trembling fingers in his palm and allowed herself to be drawn from the anteroom, through the corridor, toward the blazing brightness of the ballroom where the waltz still played, and every eye turned toward them as they emerged from the shadow. The ballroom had transformed in the seconds since Alexander led Clara onto the polished floor, the chattering crowd falling into a silence so complete that Clara could hear the whisper of her grey skirts against the wood, could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, with a violence that threatened to overwhelm her. And she had danced before, of course, in the years before her father's death, when she had been Miss Whitmore of Whitmore Hall, rather than Clara the invisible companion. But never a waltz, never this scandalous intimacy, where a gentleman's hand rested at her waist and her own trembling fingers lay upon his shoulder, and their bodies moved in a synchronization that felt dangerously, thrillingly improper. Alexander's hand was warm through the thin fabric of her dress, his touch firm but gentle as he guided her into the first steps, and Clara stumbled slightly, her inexperience evident. But he adjusted smoothly, his grey eyes meeting hers with an expression that held no judgment, only encouragement, and something else she dared not name. He asked her quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear beneath the violin melody that swirled around them like honeyed wine, why she had been watching from the stairs, why she hid in shadows when she so clearly loved the music. And Clara found herself answering with an honesty that shocked her, explaining in halting phrases about companions knowing their place, about the invisibility that was both burden and protection, about how it was easier to watch life from the margins than to risk the pain of participating and being reminded of all she had lost. Alexander's response shattered her careful resignation with words she had not expected. His observation that her position did not diminish her worth, that intelligence and grace were not the exclusive province of ladies with fortunes and pedigrees, that he had noticed her on the stairs precisely because she was watching with the eyes of someone who truly saw rather than merely looked, someone who understood beauty and yearned for connection rather than simply hunting for advantage. Clara felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely, her body moving now with less awkwardness as she began to trust his guidance, as she allowed herself to feel the extraordinary intimacy of the waltz, his hand at her waist burning like a brand through grey wool, his fingers clasped with hers in a connection that seemed to convey more than any words could express. She asked him, her voice barely above a whisper, why he had sought her out, why a duke would abandon his obligations to dance with a nobody, and he told her with devastating simplicity that she was not a nobody, that in 2 hours of dancing with eligible young ladies he had not encountered a single genuine moment until he saw her face in the candlelight on the stairs, that something in her expression of longing mixed with dignity had struck him as profoundly real in a world of practiced artifice. Clara began in that moment to see him not as the Duke of Thornfield, not as the most eligible bachelor in London, not as a figure of impossible distance, but as Alexander, a man who seemed as weary of pretense as she was, whose boredom she had witnessed from her hidden vantage point, whose eyes held loneliness beneath their aristocratic reserve. The music swelled toward its conclusion, their steps slowing, and Alexander held her gaze as he said softly that this would not be their last dance, a promise that resonated through her body like a bell. The waltz ended, silence crashed over them again, and Alexander bowed with perfect formality while Clara curtsied with shaking knees, and then he was escorting her back to where Georgiana stood, with an expression of mingled horror and fascination. And as Clara took her place behind her employer's chair, she heard the gossip explode around them like cannon fire, Lady Caroline Montague's voice rising above the others in acid speculation about desperate companions and incomprehensible ducal whims, but Clara barely heard any of it, because Alexander's words kept echoing in her mind, because for the first time in 8 years since her father's death, she felt seen, truly seen, and that dangerous, impossible hope she had tried so hard to suppress was unfurling in her chest like spring flowers breaking through frozen ground. The carriage that carried Clara and Lady Georgiana Sinclair through the lamp-lit streets of London moved through a world transformed. Or perhaps it was Clara herself who had been transformed in the space of a single waltz, making the familiar route from Mayfair to Georgiana's modest townhouse in Bloomsbury seem like a journey through foreign territory, where every shadow held new significance and every gaslight blazed with almost painful brightness. Georgiana sat across from her in the small compartment, her rose silk gown now properly repaired, her face troubled in the flickering light that came through the carriage windows as they passed street lamps and the illuminated windows of great houses still ablaze with parties and revelry, and she was speaking in the gentle but worried tones she employed when discussing difficult matters, explaining that, while the Duke of Thornfield was certainly an honourable gentleman, his attentions to a companion must be understood as a momentary aberration, a kind impulse perhaps, or possibly simple curiosity about someone outside his usual sphere, but nothing that could or should be encouraged, because the reality of Clara's position was precarious at best, dependent entirely on Georgiana's goodwill and the continued tolerance of Georgiana's family, who provided the modest income that allowed her to maintain even this small household and employ a companion at all. Clara listened with the part of her mind that had learned over 8 years to be practical, to accept reality, to protect herself from hope, while another part kept returning obsessively to the sensation of Alexander's hand at her waist, to the intensity in his grey eyes when he told her she was not a nobody, to the promise implicit in his words that this would not be their last dance. And she heard herself assuring Georgiana that she understood completely, that she had no expectations whatsoever, that she knew her place and would not presume beyond it, even as something wild and desperate in her chest screamed against these sensible words. The carriage arrived at the narrow townhouse with its peeling paint and modest facade, so different from the grand establishments they had left behind, and Clara helped Georgiana descend, gathered the shawls and reticules, performed all the small services that comprised her daily existence, and inside the house Mrs. Eleanor Ashford waited in the small front hall, ostensibly to ensure all was well, but really, Clara suspected, because the housekeeper had a fondness for her and worried over her welfare with almost maternal concern, and Eleanor's eyes met Clara's with a knowing warmth that suggested she had heard already about the extraordinary events of the evening through that mysterious network by which servants always knew everything before their employers thought to tell them. Clara assisted Georgiana in preparing for bed, unlacing her stays, unpinning her elaborate coiffure, listening to her continued gentle warnings about ducal attention being as fleeting as it was incomprehensible, and finally she climbed the narrow stairs to her own small room in the attic, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a trunk containing all her worldly possessions. The contrast between this sparse chamber and the glittering ballroom she had left so acute, it made her chest ache with something between grief and fury at the injustice of a world that measured worth in guineas and pedigree. She undressed by the light of a single candle, her grey dress appearing even more shabby and worn in the intimate light, and she tried with all her considerable discipline to be rational, to remember that she was 26 years old with no fortune, no family, no prospects, that her father had died 8 years ago, leaving nothing but debts after his business partner's betrayal, that she had been fortunate to secure her position with Georgiana after 2 years of far worse situations in households where companions were treated little better than servants, that hoping for anything more than this small security was madness. But as she finally blew out the candle and lay in darkness, she could still feel the imprint of Alexander's touch burning through her skin, and despite every reasonable argument she constructed, impossible hope bloomed inside her like roses forcing their way through stone. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Clara woke on the morning of April 16th to pale sunlight filtering through the small window of her attic room, the events of the previous evening seeming almost dreamlike in their improbability, and she rose at her customary early hour to begin the familiar routines that structured her days, washing her face in the cold water from the pitcher on her washstand, dressing in a plain brown muslin that bore testimony to many careful mendings, descending the narrow stairs to help Eleanor prepare Lady Georgiana's breakfast tray with its careful arrangement of tea and toast and strawberry preserves. Eleanor watched her with knowing eyes that held questions the housekeeper was too tactful to voice directly, though she did remark as she sliced bread that the household had been quite the topic of discussion among staff at neighbouring houses, and Clara felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, even as she assured Eleanor that the previous evening's extraordinary incident was merely a moment's kindness from a gentleman too well bred to leave anyone awkwardly positioned, nothing more, and certainly nothing that would be repeated. She was carrying Georgiana's tray up the main stairs when the knock came at the front door, unusually loud and official for the early hour, and she paused on the landing as the young footman answered to reveal a liveried messenger bearing an arrangement of white roses so massive it seemed to fill the narrow entrance hall with blooms, their petals perfect and pristine, their fragrance filling the modest house with a perfume that spoke of hothouse cultivation and expense far beyond what was common even among the wealthy families Clara had served. The footman stood paralyzed with shock until Eleanor hurried forward to accept the flowers, and Clara remained frozen on the stairs as the messenger presented a card, his livery marking him as servant to a ducal household, and Eleanor's voice carried clearly as she read aloud the simple inscription written in a bold, masculine hand. For the Lady of the Stairs. The household erupted into barely suppressed chaos, the scullery maid abandoning her work to peer at the roses, the cook emerging from the kitchen with flour-dusted hands, Eleanor's face cycling through expressions of delight and concern as she looked up to where Clara stood clutching the breakfast tray like a shield. And then Georgiana herself appeared in her dressing gown, drawn by the commotion, her eyes widening as she took in the extravagant display. Clara descended slowly and set the tray aside, her hands trembling as she accepted the card from Eleanor, the heavy paper stock another mark of quality and expense. And Georgiana drew her quickly into the small morning room, away from the avid eyes of the servants, closing the door with a decisive click before turning to Clara with an expression of profound worry. She spoke gently but firmly about the danger of encouraging a duke's fleeting interest, citing the cautionary tale of a companion in her cousin's household whose position had been ruined by similar attentions from a gentleman, how the woman had been dismissed when the gentleman inevitably moved on, left with a tarnished reputation and unable to secure another respectable placement, and Clara listened with the part of her that understood the wisdom of these warnings, even as another part clutched the card, bearing Alexander's message, and refused to release it. Georgiana extracted Clara's promise that she would not respond to this gesture, that she would treat it as the brief fancy it surely was, and Clara gave her word, though the syllables felt like stones in her mouth. And then Eleanor was arranging the roses in every available vase and placing the largest arrangement in Clara's room over her protests. And Clara found herself alone with the flowers in the afternoon light, reaching out to touch the velvet petals with fingers that remembered the warmth of Alexander's hand at her waist, while several miles away in his grand townhouse, Alexander sat at his desk issuing instructions to his secretary with an expression of calm determination that made his friend Richard, who had arrived to deliver warnings about scandal, realize with dawning alarm that the Duke of Thornfield was not engaging in a momentary fancy, but rather embarking on a courtship that would defy every expectation of society. The afternoon of April the 18th arrived with that particular quality of spring light that transforms London's Hyde Park into something almost pastoral, the tender green of new leaves catching the sun as if determined to prove that beauty could exist even in the heart of a city built on commerce and hierarchy. And Lady Georgiana Sinclair had decided that her elderly Aunt Matilda required fresh air and a change of scene from the stuffy confines of the townhouse, which meant that Clara found herself pushing the bath chair along the wide gravelled paths, while Georgiana walked alongside carrying a parasol and remarking on the unseasonable warmth of the weather. Clara had spent the 2 days since the white roses arrived in a state of careful discipline, refusing to allow herself to dwell on the memory of Alexander's grey eyes or the sensation of his hand at her waist, reminding herself hourly that dukes did not court penniless companions, no matter how kindly they might behave in a moment of impulse, and she had almost succeeded in restoring her usual resigned equilibrium when she looked up from navigating the bath chair around a cluster of nursemaids with their young charges to see Alexander Pembroke himself walking toward them along the same path with Lord Richard Hastings at his side. The encounter appeared entirely accidental, a chance meeting of the sort that occurred frequently in the fashionable hours when all of society promenaded through the park. But something in the way Alexander's expression shifted when he saw them, a certain satisfaction in his eyes, made Clara suspect this meeting was anything but coincidental. And her suspicion was confirmed when Georgiana murmured under her breath that the Duke must have discovered their usual walking route, Alexander approached with perfect propriety, bowing to Georgiana and requesting permission to walk alongside their party, and Georgiana could hardly refuse such a request from a man of his rank, though Clara saw the worry in her eyes as she granted permission, and then Richard was engaging Georgiana in conversation about some mutual acquaintance, while Alexander positioned himself on the other side of the bath chair, where Clara continued to push, his tall form matching his stride to her slower pace. He did not speak immediately, seeming content to walk in silence while Aunt Matilda dozed in her chair and made small snoring sounds that would have been mortifying if the old lady had been conscious enough to hear them. And Clara kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, acutely aware of Alexander's presence beside her, of the way passing members of society turned to stare at the curious sight of a duke walking with a companion rather than with the lady she served. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only Clara could hear, and he asked her about her education, where she had learned to read so widely, and Clara found herself answering carefully that her father had been a gentleman of modest means, but considerable learning, who had believed daughters deserved the same intellectual training as sons, and she had been tutored alongside her brother until her brother's death from fever at age 10 had left her an only child. Alexander listened with an attention that seemed almost fierce in its focus, and then he mentioned a novel she had noticed on the side table in Georgiana's drawing room 3 days ago when he had called, asking if she had read it, and Clara realized with a shock that moved through her chest like heat that he had been observing her environment closely enough to note what books surrounded her. The evening of April 20th arrived with that peculiar mixture of anticipation and dread that Clara had come to associate with any event that drew her beyond the safe boundaries of Lady Georgiana's household, and she dressed in her best gown, a simple creation of pale blue muslin that Georgiana had passed to her after a single season. The fabric still fine, though the style was 2 years outdated, and she studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand with the critical eye of someone who knew exactly how she would compare to the other guests at Lady Beatrice Thornhill's dinner party. The residence itself took Clara's breath when their carriage drew up before it, a gracious townhouse on a fashionable square that spoke of wealth wielded with taste rather than ostentation, and Lady Beatrice herself greeted them in the entrance hall with a warmth that seemed entirely genuine, her hand clasping Clara's for a moment longer than courtesy required, while her eyes, so like her brother's in their clear grey depths, conveyed a welcome that made Clara's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. The dinner party proved intimate, as Alexander had promised, only 12 guests arranged around a table that gleamed with silver and crystal, and Clara felt her anxiety spike when she recognized Lady Caroline Montague among the company, that woman's sharp features arranging themselves into an expression of surprise that was clearly performed for the room's benefit when she noted Clara's presence. But the seating arrangement sent a message that even Lady Caroline could not misinterpret, for Clara found herself placed not in the position of insignificance that companions usually occupied, but rather seated where a lady of consequence would sit, with Alexander himself across from her, and a distinguished gentleman scholar on her right, who engaged her immediately in conversation about the agricultural reform bills currently being debated in Parliament. Clara had read extensively on the subject from the newspapers that Georgiana passed to her, and she found herself speaking with a confidence that grew as the gentleman listened with respect, and when the conversation expanded to include discussion of Gothic architecture, and then to the new poetry of Lord Byron, Clara contributed observations that drew nods of agreement from several guests, and a look of undisguised pride from Alexander that made her pulse quicken. Lady Caroline attempted twice to redirect conversation toward gossip about mutual acquaintances, and twice Alexander smoothly steered discussion back to substantive matters. But when Caroline made a pointed remark about how surprising it was to find such learning in unexpected quarters, Alexander's response was direct and cutting, his voice carrying clearly as he stated that intelligence recognized no boundaries of birth or fortune, and that he found narrow minds far more surprising than educated ones, regardless of their origins. The silence that followed was broken by Lady Beatrice's light laugh and her agreement with her brother's sentiment, and Clara felt the attention of the room shift in some indefinable way, as if Alexander had drawn a line that guests must now choose whether to cross. After dinner, Lady Beatrice requested music, and Clara found herself at the pianoforte with sheet music for a Mozart sonata that she had learned years ago in her father's house, her fingers finding the notes with only slight hesitation, while Alexander stood beside her turning pages, and when their hands brushed during one exchange of sheets, the contact sent such heat through Clara's body that she nearly missed her entry into the next passage. He leaned close under the pretense of examining the music, and whispered a request to call on her properly, with full courtship intentions declared, and Clara's response came in an equally quiet voice, reminding him of the impossibility of such an arrangement. But his answer, delivered as his fingers deliberately covered hers on the ivory keys for one suspended moment, was that nothing was impossible if two people were determined enough, and Clara's hands trembled so badly she had to stop playing and claim fatigue. The morning of April 25th arrived with skies so clear and blue they seemed to promise that the world might indeed contain more possibility than Clara's experience had taught her to expect, and she woke in her small attic room to find sunlight streaming through the single window with an intensity that felt almost like benediction, though she chided herself for such fanciful thinking as she dressed in her usual grey morning gown and descended to help Eleanor prepare Lady Georgiana's breakfast tray. The household had settled into a peculiar new rhythm over the 5 days since Lady Beatrice's dinner party, a rhythm dictated by the astonishing fact that Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Thornfield, had established a pattern of morning calls that brought him to Georgiana's modest townhouse with a regularity that suggested intention rather than idle social courtesy, and today would mark his 5th consecutive visit, a fact that Eleanor mentioned with a meaningful look as she arranged tea things on the tray while Clara sliced bread with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure. When Alexander arrived precisely at 11 o'clock, admitted by the footman who no longer looked surprised by the ducal presence on their doorstep, Clara was seated in the drawing-room with Georgiana working on embroidery that she had no genuine interest in completing, and she felt, rather than saw, Alexander's eyes find her immediately upon his entrance, that familiar intensity of his attention making her acutely aware of every detail of her appearance and surroundings. The calls had developed their own choreography by now, with Alexander ostensibly paying his respects to Georgiana while positioning himself where his conversation would naturally include Clara, and Georgiana had moved from shock through worry to a kind of bemused acceptance of this disruption to her household's normal order, though Clara sometimes caught her employer watching the interactions with an expression that mixed concern with something that looked almost like vicarious hope. This morning's conversation began with politics, Alexander soliciting Georgiana's views on the recent legislation regarding poor relief before turning to Clara with a question about agricultural practices she had mentioned during their park encounter, and Clara found herself speaking with increasing ease about crop rotation and tenant farming, her father's interest in modern methods having given her knowledge that few ladies of any station possessed. The discussion evolved naturally into debate about education, and when Clara suggested that women's minds were capable of the same rigorous intellectual training as men's, if given opportunity, Alexander agreed with such enthusiasm that he leaned forward in his chair, his tea forgotten on the side table, and asked what subjects she would teach if she had the means to establish a school for girls. And Clara's answer about mathematics and natural philosophy and classical languages prompted him to declare that such a school would produce women of genuine substance rather than the decorative accomplishments that passed for female education in most circles. Georgiana interjected with gentle humor that they were becoming rather revolutionary in their sentiments, and Alexander laughed, but his eyes remained on Clara as he said that true revolution would be recognizing merit wherever it existed, regardless of sex or station, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the way his words seemed to carry meaning beyond their surface. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Clara dared not name, and then Georgiana was called away by Eleanor to settle some household matter regarding the week's marketing, her apologetic glance toward Clara conveying both permission to remain and warning to observe propriety. And suddenly, Clara found herself alone with Alexander for the first time since he had whispered to her at the pianoforte 5 days before. The afternoon of April 28th found Clara standing in her accustomed position behind Lady Georgiana's chair in Lady Beaumont's crowded drawing room, where the spring sunshine streaming through tall windows illuminated a gathering of perhaps 30 ladies taking tea and engaging in the sort of conversation that passed for afternoon entertainment among those who had both leisure and social standing to maintain, and Clara had learned long ago to make herself invisible at such events, to become merely part of the furniture while Georgiana conversed with her equals. The room hummed with multiple conversations, the clink of china and the rustle of silk creating a backdrop to voices that rose and fell in patterns Clara could read as easily as text on a page. And she had been standing thus for perhaps 20 minutes when she became aware that one particular conversation nearby had shifted in tone, Lady Caroline Montague's distinctive voice carrying clearly, despite its false sweetness, as she spoke to 2 other women about the incomprehensible fascination that certain gentlemen of rank sometimes developed for the most unsuitable objects. Clara felt her spine stiffen as she realized she was the subject under discussion. Lady Caroline's words, carefully constructed to avoid direct naming, while ensuring everyone present understood exactly who was meant, speculation about scheming natures and calculated displays of false modesty and the danger posed to good families when nobodies attempted to rise above their proper stations. The other ladies made murmurs that could have been agreement or merely polite acknowledgement, and Clara stood frozen in her humiliation, unable to move without drawing more attention, unable to defend herself, without creating a scene that would only confirm every terrible thing being implied about her character and intentions. Georgiana's hand found Clara's where it rested on the back of the chair, a brief squeeze of solidarity that made Clara's eyes burn with unshed tears, but before either of them could decide how to extract themselves from the gathering with dignity and tact, a disturbance at the drawing-room entrance announced a new arrival, and Clara's heart performed some complicated maneuver in her chest when she saw Alexander Pembroke standing in the doorway, his height and bearing commanding immediate attention as the room fell into surprised silence at the unprecedented sight of a duke attending a ladies' afternoon gathering. His eyes found Clara immediately, and without pause for greeting or social nicety, he crossed the room directly to where she stood, the crowd parting before him while shocked whispers erupted in his wake. And when he reached her, he bowed with the same respect he would show a duchess before requesting her company for a turn in the garden. Lady Beaumont stammered some flustered permission, while Georgiana looked torn between panic and relief, and Clara felt every eye in the room burning into her back as Alexander offered his arm, and she had no choice but to accept, her hand trembling visibly as she placed it on his sleeve and allowed him to guide her through the drawing-room and out through French doors into the garden beyond, where early roses bloomed in beds bordered by low hedges that provided the illusion of privacy while still remaining technically within view of the house. The moment they were far enough from the doors to speak without being overheard, Clara pulled her hand from his arm and turned to face him. All the fear and frustration and hopelessness of her position suddenly breaking through the careful control she had maintained, her voice shaking as she told him he could not keep doing this, that every public attention he paid her damaged both their reputations further, that she was already being called a schemer, and worse, that his family would never accept her, and he would come to regret the scandal he was creating, that her position was impossible and growing more so by the day. The morning of May 1st arrived grey and heavy with the threat of rain, the leaden sky seeming to press down upon the modest townhouse, where Clara stood at the breakfast-room window, watching droplets streak the glass, while behind her, Lady Georgiana's voice shook with tears as she tried to explain the impossible position in which she found herself. The letters from her family spread across the table like accusations made manifest in expensive stationery and stern handwriting. Clara had known something was wrong from the moment she descended from her attic room at dawn to find Eleanor in the kitchen with red eyes and a pinched expression, had felt the weight of crisis even before Georgiana summoned her to explain that her brother and his wife had written in the strongest possible terms, demanding that Clara be dismissed immediately before the scandal of the Duke of Thornfield's incomprehensible attentions could spread to taint the entire Sinclair family name, and her elderly aunt had included a letter threatening to cut off the small quarterly allowance that made the difference between Georgiana's genteel poverty and actual deprivation. Georgiana wept openly as she told Clara that she could not afford to lose her family's support, that her late husband had left her with barely enough to maintain appearances, and without her aunt's contribution, she would be forced to let the townhouse and retire to some cottage in the country. And Clara felt her heart break not for herself, but for the genuine anguish in her employer's face as she apologized over and over for her weakness, for her inability to withstand her family's pressure, for choosing her own security over Clara's welfare. Clara moved from the window to take Georgiana's hand and tell her with all the conviction she could summon that she understood completely, that no apology was necessary, that she had known from the moment Alexander first paid her attention that it would lead to consequences she could not afford, and she would begin immediately seeking a new position, though they both knew that references would be difficult, given the circumstances, and that her name was now too much talked about in London for any respectable household to take her on. Eleanor entered with fresh tea and her own tears barely controlled, and Clara felt the strange calm that sometimes comes when feared catastrophe finally arrives, and there is nothing left to do but endure it with what dignity remains. And she went upstairs to her small room to begin packing her few belongings into the battered trunk that had accompanied her through her 4 years of employment. As she folded her spare grey dress and her nightgowns and the single good shawl she owned, Clara made herself write the note she knew must be written, her hand steady as she addressed it to Alexander at his London residence, and penned words releasing him from any sense of obligation toward her, explaining that she was grateful for his kindness, but understood that the social barriers between them were insurmountable, and she would not be the cause of further damage to his standing or estrangement from his family, and she begged him to forget her and fulfill the duties his position demanded. Eleanor appeared in the doorway as Clara sealed the note and wordlessly held out her hand for it, some communication passing between the two women that needed no speech, and Clara knew the housekeeper would see it delivered, despite any instruction to the contrary. Scarcely 2 hours later, the sound of a carriage in the street below brought all 3 women to alertness, and when the knock came at the door, and Eleanor returned to announce that the Duke of Thornfield insisted on an audience, Clara felt panic surge through her carefully maintained composure, and she refused to go down, could not bear to see him, and hold to her resolution. So she remained in her room while Alexander spoke with Georgiana in the drawing-room below. What Clara could not know as she pressed her ear to the attic stairs, trying to hear the murmur of voices from below, was that Alexander had received her note an hour before and had come immediately with a solution that would preserve everyone's honor, and when Georgiana finally climbed the stairs to find Clara, she could barely speak through her shock, as she reported that Alexander had declared his intention to marry Clara and had requested only time enough to properly secure her independence and handle his family before making a formal offer. And he had assured Georgiana that removing Clara from her employment now would actually solve rather than create problems, since it would allow him to establish Clara in his sister's household, where she could be chaperoned with perfect respectability while he arranged matters. Clara sank onto the top stair, exactly as she had once stood on the servants' stairs, watching Alexander dance in a ballroom that seemed a lifetime ago rather than merely 16 days past. And through the banister, she could see him standing in the entrance hall, looking upward, though she knew he could not see her in the shadows, and his voice carried clearly as he told Georgiana he would have everything arranged within the month, that Clara would want for nothing, regardless of what his family chose to do, that he had never been more certain of anything in his life, and Clara tasted salt and realized tears were streaming down her face as she watched him depart with one last glance toward the stairs, where she hid and trembled with hope she no longer had the strength to resist. The afternoon of May the 3rd found Alexander standing in the formal drawing-room of Pembroke House, the imposing estate on the western edge of London where he had spent his childhood and where his mother, the Dowager Duchess, still maintained residence with all the authority of her position, and he had requested this meeting knowing it would be difficult but unprepared for the full force of maternal horror that greeted his announcement of his intention to marry Clara Whitmore. His mother, still handsome at 52 with silver threading through dark hair and the bearing of a woman who had never questioned her place in the natural order of society, stared at him for a full 10 seconds of silence before beginning a systematic catalogue of everything Clara lacked that made such a union unthinkable, her voice rising with each point as she detailed the absence of proper birth, of fortune, of family connections, of youth since Clara at 26 was practically on the shelf, and Alexander stood before her feeling like a boy again, called to account for some transgression, except this time he had no intention of yielding to authority that seemed suddenly arbitrary and cruel. He let his mother exhaust her initial fury before responding with deliberate calm, speaking of Clara's character and intelligence and grace, describing the dignity with which she bore dismissal and insult, explaining that he had found in her a companion of mind and heart, such as he had never imagined finding, among the eligible young ladies who had been paraded before him for 10 seasons, and he reminded his mother that his own father had married for love against his family's wishes, and had counted it the best decision of his life. The dowager's face softened briefly at the mention of her late husband before hardening again as she informed Alexander that his father had been a second son with no title to consider, no great estates to preserve, no duty to an ancient lineage that demanded suitable alliances, and the weight of those expectations pressed down on Alexander as his mother continued speaking of duty and responsibility, and the scandal that would permanently taint the Pembroke name if he insisted on this madness. Alexander felt something tear inside him as he stood between love and obligation, and his mother must have sensed his wavering, because she pressed her advantage with an ultimatum delivered in tones that permitted no compromise, telling him he must choose between this unsuitable passion and his family's support, that if he proceeded with marrying a nobody companion, his mother would not receive Clara, and would ensure that most of society followed her lead, creating a scandal far worse than the current whispers that might still be silenced if Alexander came to his senses and directed his attentions toward someone appropriate. The drawing-room felt suffocating despite its high ceilings and tall windows, and Alexander found himself looking out at the manicured gardens where he had played as a child under his father's indulgent eye, and he understood with sudden clarity that he must give Clara the choice rather than forcing her into a position where marriage to him meant social warfare and family estrangement, that he must first secure her independence so she could refuse him if she wished rather than accepting from desperation. His resolution formed even as his heart ached with the knowledge that restoring her father's stolen estate would take time he begrudged, and he told his mother quietly that he would not debate the matter further, but neither would he abandon his intentions, and he left Pembroke House with her warning ringing in his ears, about the consequences of defying both family and society. In his carriage returning to his London residence, Alexander sat in the gathering dusk and let himself feel the full weight of what he was choosing, the potential loss of everything familiar, warring with the memory of Clara's face when she had looked at him in the garden and told him he would regret his interest in her, and his hands clenched into fists as he thought of her believing herself unworthy, when in truth she possessed more genuine nobility than half the titled ladies of his acquaintance, and his resolution strengthened rather than weakened as he determined that he would give her independence first, and his heart after, so she could choose freely, without the taint of obligation or desperation. The evening of May the 5th found Clara standing at the window of the nursery in Lady Beatrice Thornhill's elegant townhouse, watching the lamplighters make their rounds through streets that seemed to belong to a different world than the one she now inhabited in this strange, suspended state between employment and uncertainty. And she had been residing under Beatrice's roof for 4 days now, in a position that defied easy definition, since she was neither guest nor servant, but something in between, helping with Beatrice's 3 young children in a capacity that resembled a governess, but without the formality of wages or contract. Beatrice had been unfailingly kind since collecting Clara from Georgiana's townhouse, with a warmth that seemed genuine rather than dutiful, and she had explained with admirable frankness that her brother was handling legal matters that required time and discretion, but that Clara should consider herself welcome for as long as necessary. And Clara had accepted this charity because she had no alternative, and because some part of her still hoped, despite every rational argument, against such foolishness. The children were sweet and undemanding, 2 girls of 7 and 5, and a boy of 3, and Clara found some comfort in reading to them and helping with their lessons and playing simple games in the garden. But the whispers of the household staff followed her through the corridors, speculation about the Duke's scandalous interest, and whether Clara was his mistress in all but name, and she bore their judgment with the same dignity she had learned to employ against crueler insults, though each whispered word felt like another small cut. 2 weeks had passed since Alexander had stood in Georgiana's entrance hall and declared his intention to marry her, 14 days during which Clara had received no word from him directly, though Beatrice assured her repeatedly that he was occupied with solicitors and investigations into her father's estate. And with each day that passed, Clara felt her fragile hope eroding under the steady pressure of doubt, until she lay awake at night in the comfortable bedroom Beatrice had provided and tried to prepare herself for the inevitable moment when Alexander would realize the impossibility of what he had promised and withdraw with whatever apologies his conscience demanded. She attempted to be practical about her future, discussing with Beatrice the possibility of a position in the country, far from London, where the scandal might not have penetrated, and Beatrice listened with sympathy, but insisted that Clara must have more faith in Alexander's constancy, though even Beatrice admitted that the Dowager Duchess had refused to receive her since learning of Clara's presence in her daughter's home, and that the family conflict was causing Alexander considerable pain. On the evening of May the 5th, as Clara stood at the nursery window watching darkness settle over London, she did not know that at that very moment Alexander sat in his study, surrounded by legal documents that represented weeks of intensive investigation, nor could she know that his solicitors had finally uncovered proof that her father's business partner, Thomas Ridley, had systematically falsified contracts and forged her father's signature to steal the small but prosperous estate that should have been Clara's inheritance after her father's death 4 years prior. And Alexander's grim satisfaction at this discovery was tempered by his frustration at the legal complications that would require months to fully resolve through the courts. What Clara also could not know, as she turned from the window to help the nursemaid settle the children for bed, was that Alexander had already purchased a small house in her name on a quiet street in a respectable neighborhood, establishing an independent income for her regardless of whether the legal case succeeded, because he was determined that when he finally asked her to marry him, she would have the freedom to refuse without fear of destitution, and his instructions to his man of affairs had been explicit that Clara must have choices, rather than being forced by circumstance into accepting an offer that might bring her more pain than joy, given his family's opposition. The morning of May 10th arrived with unexpected sunshine, breaking through the London fog that had persisted for nearly a week, and Clara stood in the garden of Beatrice's townhouse, watching the children chase each other around the carefully tended rose bushes, while she tried to ignore the hollow ache that had taken up permanent residence in her chest during the 3 weeks since she had last seen Alexander. She told herself she was foolish to have expected anything different, that a duke did not overturn his entire life for a woman of no consequence, no matter what promises he might make in moments of misguided passion, and yet some stubborn part of her heart refused to accept what her rational mind knew to be inevitable truth. The sound of the garden gate opening made her turn, expecting Beatrice's gardener, but instead she found Alexander himself standing there in the morning light, looking tired and determined and more beautiful than she had remembered, and her breath caught in her throat as he crossed the garden toward her with long strides that suggested he had been restraining himself from running. The children stopped their play to stare at the tall gentleman, who bowed gravely to Clara as though she were a duchess herself, and she found herself curtsying in return, while her heart hammered so violently she feared he must hear it. And when he asked if they might speak privately, she could only nod and follow him to the small stone bench beneath the cherry tree at the far end of the garden, where the new leaves provided a screen of privacy. Alexander sat beside her closer than propriety permitted, and took both her hands in his before she could think to protest. And the warmth of his touch after so many weeks of absence made tears spring to her eyes despite her determination to maintain composure, and he spoke quickly, as though afraid she might flee before he could finish what he had come to say. He told her that he had spent every day of the past 3 weeks working with his solicitors to untangle the theft of her father's estate, that they had uncovered proof of systematic fraud by her father's former partner, Thomas Ridley, who had forged documents and bribed officials to steal what should have been Clara's inheritance, and that while the legal case would take months to work through the courts, he had already taken steps to secure her independence regardless of that outcome. Clara listened in stunned silence as Alexander explained that he had purchased a house in her name on Weston Street, a respectable neighborhood where she could live with complete independence, and that he had established an account that would provide her with £300 annually, so she would never again be dependent on anyone's charity or forced into the humiliating position of companion. The practical details washed over Clara while she tried to understand what this meant, why he was giving her independence unless it was to free himself from any obligation toward her. And she must have spoken that fear aloud, because Alexander's hands tightened on hers and his voice turned fierce as he told her that he was ensuring her freedom so she could refuse him without consequence when he asked what he had no right to ask. Clara's confusion must have shown on her face, because Alexander smiled slightly and said that he would not propose marriage to a woman who had no choice but to accept, that he needed her to have the independence to refuse him, so that when she said yes, he would know it was freely given from love rather than necessity. And the word love fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Clara thought she understood about her situation. The silence stretched between them in the dappled shadow of the cherry tree, while Clara tried to comprehend what Alexander had just said, the word love still resonating through her chest, like the deep note of a bell that continues vibrating long after it has been struck, and she found herself staring at their joined hands because she could not yet meet his eyes while her mind struggled to reconcile his words with everything she believed about her place in the world and his obligations to his position. Alexander seemed content to wait while she processed what he had offered, his thumbs moving gently across her knuckles in a rhythm that was both soothing and distracting. And when she finally found her voice, it emerged smaller than she intended, as she asked him how he could speak of love when they had known each other for less than a month. And he was a duke with responsibilities to his family, and his name, while she was nobody from nowhere with nothing to recommend her except the ability to read and a passable knowledge of household management. His response came, swift and certain, as he told her that he had known enough about her character within 10 minutes of their first waltz to understand she possessed more genuine worth than any of the eligible ladies his mother had paraded before him during the past 5 seasons, and that the weeks since had only confirmed his initial assessment that Clara Whitmore was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and grace and quiet strength who had been rendered invisible by a society too shallow to recognize true value when it stood before them. Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, though she had not been aware of crying, and she tried to withdraw her hands to wipe her face, but Alexander held them firmly and used his own thumb to brush away the moisture on her left cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. And he continued speaking in that low, intense voice that seemed to wrap around her like a physical embrace. He told her that he understood she had no reason to trust the constancy of a man she barely knew, that his position and privilege gave him power to devastate her life if his interest proved fleeting, and that was precisely why he had spent the past 3 weeks establishing her independence rather than pressing his suit, because he needed her to have the freedom to refuse him. Clara shook her head slowly, trying to find words for the tumult of emotion rising within her, the fierce joy warring with terror and disbelief, and she whispered that she did not understand why he would want someone like her when he could have anyone, any beautiful, accomplished, wealthy girl who would bring honor to his name rather than scandal. And the look that crossed Alexander's face was almost fierce as he said that he did not want anyone else, and had never wanted anyone else from the moment he saw her watching the ball with such longing and dignity combined, and that if she could not see her own worth, then he would spend the rest of his life showing it to her, if she would permit him the honor. The word honor fell into the space between them and seemed to shift something fundamental in Clara's understanding, because she had spent so many years believing herself to be without value that she had never considered the possibility that someone might regard knowing her as an honor rather than a burden. And the tears came harder now, though she tried to stop them because she did not want Alexander to think she was the sort of weak creature who wept at every emotional moment, even though her entire life seemed to be reordering itself around the fixed point of his steady gaze and the warmth of his hands still holding hers. She found herself speaking without fully intending to, telling him about the years since her father's death when she had learned to make herself small and invisible and useful, to take up no space that might inconvenience those who employed her, to want nothing and expect nothing, because wanting led only to disappointment and expecting led only to humiliation. And she told him about watching through windows and from doorways and from shadowed stairs at all the life and color and beauty that existed in a world she moved through but did not belong to, and how she had convinced herself that being invisible was a kind of safety, because if no one saw you, then no one could judge you wanting and dismiss you. Alexander listened without interrupting while the morning light shifted through the cherry tree leaves and made patterns on the gravel path near their feet. And when she finally ran out of suds and sat there, feeling emptied and vulnerable and more exposed than she had ever felt, even during that first waltz in front of all those staring eyes, he lifted her right hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles in a gesture that felt nothing like the empty social courtesy she had seen performed 1,000 times in drawing rooms, but instead felt like a promise and a recognition and a benediction all at once. He told her that he understood she had learned to protect herself by wanting nothing, but that he was asking her now to be brave enough to want something, to want him and the life they could build together, and he promised that if she would take the risk of trusting him, he would spend every day proving himself worthy of that trust, and that her independence was established regardless of her answer, because her freedom was not a bargaining chip, but rather a gift freely given that she could use to refuse him or accept him as she chose. Clara felt herself balanced on a precipice between the safe grey life she had known, where nothing was risked, and therefore nothing could be truly lost, and this terrifying bright possibility he was offering, where she might have everything or lose everything, and the weight of that choice pressed on her chest until she could barely breathe, and she looked up at Alexander's face and saw there such open hope and vulnerability that she realized with a shock that he was afraid too, that a duke who could command the attention of any room he entered was sitting here beside her. Terrified she would refuse him, and that recognition somehow made her own fear manageable, because she was not alone in this moment of terrible possibility. The recognition that Alexander was as vulnerable in this moment as she was herself seemed to unlock something in Clara's chest that had been bound tight since childhood, and she found herself speaking before she had fully thought through what she wanted to say, the words emerging raw and unpolished as she told him that she had watched him that first night at the ball and thought him the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, not just his face or form, but the way he moved through the world with such easy certainty, and she had never imagined that someone like him would see someone like her, much less want to know her thoughts or value her opinions. And even now, after weeks of his attention, part of her still could not believe this was truly happening, because her entire life had taught her that people like her did not get happy endings, that they existed to facilitate the happiness of others while remaining themselves in the shadows. Alexander's hands tightened on hers, and she saw something fierce and almost angry flash across his face as he said that he would never forgive the society that had taught her such lies about her own value, that had taken a woman of extraordinary worth and made her believe she was nothing, and his voice carried such conviction that Clara felt something shifting inside her, like a foundation stone being set into place after years of instability. He told her that he was asking her to take a risk that he understood was far greater for her than for him, because if things went wrong, he would still be a duke with all the protections that title afforded, while she would be left more vulnerable than before, and that was precisely why he had spent the past weeks ensuring she had legal independence and financial security regardless of her answer, because he needed her to know that refusing him would not leave her destitute or desperate. Clara realized that this was what love looked like when it was real and not the pale romance of novels, this careful tending to practical matters alongside passionate declarations, this recognition that power imbalances required deliberate action to address rather than romantic words to obscure. She took a shaking breath and felt herself stepping off the precipice into unknown space as she whispered that she did not know how to be a duchess, that she did not know how to navigate the world he lived in, or manage great estates, or host grand parties, but that she loved him with a fierceness that frightened her, and if he was certain he would not come to regret choosing her, then yes, she would marry him and spend the rest of her life trying to be worthy of the faith he had placed in her. Alexander's face transformed with such joy that it made him look years younger, and he was suddenly moving closer, and his hands were framing her face with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with fresh tears as he told her that she had always been worthy, that she would never need to earn what was already hers by right of her character. Alexander's lips touched her forehead in a gesture so tender that Clara felt her remaining defenses crumble like ancient walls finally surrendering to persistent vines. And he murmured against her skin that she would never need to prove her worth to him, because it had been evident from that first moment he saw her watching from the stairs with such longing and dignity combined. And then he was pulling back just enough to look into her eyes as he told her that he had something for her, and reached into his coat pocket to withdraw a small velvet box that made Clara's heart stutter in her chest, even as part of her mind insisted this could not be happening, because such moments belonged to heroines in novels, not to impoverished companions who had learned to expect nothing. He opened the box to reveal a ring that caught the morning light and scattered it into small rainbows across the weathered wood of the garden bench. And Clara saw that it was not some massive ducal heirloom weighted with generations of expectation, but rather a delicate gold band set with a single perfect sapphire, the deep blue of evening sky. And Alexander explained with uncharacteristic nervousness that it had belonged to his grandmother, who had also married for love against family opposition, and who had told him as a boy that he should give it some day to a woman who valued substance over show and character over consequence. Clara could not speak past the tightness in her throat as Alexander lifted her left hand with such reverence that she felt suddenly precious in a way she had never experienced before. And he told her that he knew she had agreed to marry him, but that he wanted to do this properly with a ring and a formal proposal because she deserved all the courtship rituals that other women took for granted. And then he was sliding from the bench to kneel on the gravel path in a posture of such humble devotion that Clara made a small sound of protest, because a duke should not kneel to anyone, much less to her. Alexander smiled up at her with such love plain on his face that Clara felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of her own place in the world. And he said that Clara Whitmore, would she do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife and his partner and his companion in every sense of that word, and he promised to spend his life ensuring she never again felt invisible or dismissed or less than the remarkable woman she was. And he asked if she would trust him enough to build a life together that defied every small-minded expectation society had placed on both of them. Clara nodded, because words seemed inadequate to the enormity of this moment, and Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, where it settled as though it had always belonged there, and then he was rising and gathering her into his arms in an embrace that felt like coming home after years of wandering. And Clara buried her face against his chest and breathed in the scent of him, and felt the solid reality of his body against hers, and knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and that knowledge made her feel stronger than she ever had standing alone. They remained in the garden for another quarter of an hour, wrapped in each other's arms, as the morning light strengthened around them, and the world beyond the garden walls continued its oblivious turning. And Clara found herself thinking that happiness, when it finally arrived after years of deprivation, felt almost dangerously intense, like drinking cold water too quickly after a long thirst, and she had to consciously remind herself to breathe and accept this joy, rather than waiting for it to be snatched away, as every good thing in her life had been before. Alexander seemed content simply to hold her, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, and the rise and fall of his breath, and the solid warmth of his body that made her feel more anchored to earth than she had ever felt standing alone. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion as he told her that they should probably return to the house before Beatrice sent a search party. Though he was reluctant to share her with the world, even for a moment after finally having her acceptance secured. Clara pulled back just enough to look up at him and saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears that matched her own, and she realized that this moment was as transformative for him as for her, because he too had been living in a sort of prison constructed by duty and expectation and societal role, And in choosing her, he was also choosing freedom from the suffocating limitations of his position. They walked back toward the house hand in hand, and Clara was aware of the ring on her finger catching sunlight and sending small sparks of color dancing across the grass. And she felt as though she were walking through a dream, except that dreams had never been this vivid or this substantial, or left her feeling this completely present in her own body. Beatrice was waiting in the morning room, and her face transformed with delight when she saw their joined hands, and Clara's tear-stained cheeks, and Alexander's expression of fierce joy, and she rushed forward to embrace Clara with genuine warmth, as she said she had hoped Alexander would not waste any more time, because it had been obvious to anyone with eyes that they belonged together from that first scandalous waltz. Alexander explained that he needed to speak with his mother again now that the engagement was official, and that he expected resistance but was prepared to stand firm, and Beatrice's expression sobered as she acknowledged the difficulties ahead, but promised her support and her willingness to help Clara navigate the treacherous waters of becoming a duchess. Clara felt a flutter of anxiety at the reminder of all the practical challenges that lay ahead, because accepting Alexander's proposal in a private garden was one thing, but actually becoming the Duchess of Thornfield and managing estates and social obligations and hostile family members was quite another. Yet when Alexander's hand tightened on hers, she felt her courage returning, because whatever came, they would face it together, and that made all the difference. Beatrice ordered fresh tea and pastries brought to the morning room, and the three of them sat together planning the next steps with Beatrice, offering advice about managing the Dowager Duchess and navigating society's judgment and the 1,000 small details involved in preparing for a wedding that would be scrutinized by all of London. And Clara found herself grateful beyond measure for this woman who had opened her home and heart without hesitation, and who treated her, not as a charity case but as a beloved sister already. The afternoon stretched long and golden as Alexander prepared to visit Beatrice's residence to finally speak with Clara after weeks of separation that had felt like years. And as his carriage rolled through the London streets, he rehearsed what he would say, though the words seemed inadequate to convey the depth of what he felt and the magnitude of what he hoped to offer her. He had dressed with unusual care in a deep blue coat that his valet mentioned brought out his eyes, though Alexander had never cared about such things before Clara, and in his pocket rested both the ring that had belonged to his grandmother and the legal documents that proved Clara's father's estate had indeed been stolen through fraudulent manipulation, and that Alexander's solicitors had successfully recovered through a combination of legal pressure and Alexander's willingness to purchase the disputed property outright from the man who had cheated Clara's father. The weight of these items in his pockets felt significant, as though they represented two different paths to Clara's freedom, one material and one emotional, and Alexander was determined to offer both, though he hoped desperately that she would accept the latter, even if she rejected the former out of pride. His mother had not spoken to him in the 3 weeks since their confrontation, and the Dowager Duchess had made her displeasure known throughout society through carefully worded comments that stopped just short of open condemnation, and Alexander knew that his choice to proceed with this courtship would create a permanent rift with his family that might never fully heal. Yet every time doubt crept in, he remembered Clara's face as she had looked up at him during that first waltz with such wonder and disbelief mingled together, and he knew that he could not abandon her to please people who valued bloodlines over character. Richard had tried once more that morning to convince Alexander to reconsider with arguments about duty and dynasty and the importance of marrying a woman who could navigate society without scandal, and Alexander had listened patiently before explaining that Clara's inability to navigate society's poisonous waters without creating ripples was precisely because she refused to compromise her integrity for social acceptance, and that quality was worth more to him than a wife who could smile charmingly while engaging in the same petty cruelties that made society so suffocating. The carriage pulled up before Beatrice's townhouse, and Alexander saw the curtain twitch in an upstairs window and wondered if Clara was watching his arrival with the same anxious hope that made his own chest tight with anticipation. Beatrice answered the door herself rather than waiting for her butler, which suggested she had been watching for him, and her expression was warm but cautious as she led him not to the formal drawing-room, but to the small morning-room, where light streamed through tall windows and made the dust motes dance like small stars suspended in golden air. She told him that Clara was in the garden and had been there since dawn, tending the roses with a single-minded focus that Beatrice recognized as Clara's way of managing overwhelming emotion, and Alexander felt his heart contract at the image of Clara seeking solace among flowers because she could not seek it in his arms.